the sector has performed. Uma did tell you about the parameters, the process that we followed. Extremely rigorous, and we hope extremely unbiased. And with independent assurance, we can assure you that the assessment that we have done is probably the best that ever has happened in this country. So, to start with, I'm going to tell you about on key indicators how the sector has performed. Let's look at energy, how the sector has performed. We had data for all the 21 plants on energy. The global best practice is about 4.4 gigacal per ton of crude steel or liquid steel. The average for India was 6.6, which is about 45% higher than the global best practice. Huge difference within plants in Indian steel industry. The best, which was Spark, was 5.4 gigacal per ton. The worst was Usha Martin at 10 gigacal. So you can understand the range of energy consumption that is there in Indian steel industry. Water. Steel is a sector which doesn't need water as much as paper industry needs. As Sunita said before, even today a paper industry needs about 100 tons of water to produce a ton of paper. Steel doesn't need that much water. Still, if you look at it, the global best practice for water consumption, process water consumption in steel industry is about a meter cube per ton of steel. The average for India was 3.5. But this 3.5 is a misleading number. In fact, in one area where we didn't get better numbers was water. Because the steel industry has township, power production, as well as process, and water auditing was very poor. This is one area where a lot of auditing and process improvement needs to be there. So about 3.5 times higher than the global best practice, but if you include, for example, township power, then you see steel industry also consumes huge amount of water. For example, if you look at SAIL Burnpur, it consumes about 32 tons of water to produce a ton of steel, including township and all the processes. Land, this is for the first time, GRP has included land as an indicator. And the reason being very simple, as we started our assessment, we found a lot of companies has huge amount of unutilized land. In fact, the 21 companies that we rated had 66,000 hectares of land to produce about 70 million tons of steel, which is approximately 1,200 hectares per million ton of steel capacity, which is absolutely inefficient. We have in this country plants like Essar Steel, which is using only about 65 hectares per million ton plant capacity. So the steel can be produced with much efficient land utilization. CO2 emission, big issue. And I've heard that the steel industry has a committee to look at global warming, but doesn't seem to be getting translated into performance. The average CO2 emission of Indian steel sector is about 2.7 tons per ton of crude steel. Global best practice is 1.4. Our gas-based plant, that is Essar Steel, is more or less, steel is about at the level of global best practice. Tata Steel was the best in blast furnace and BOF process. Pollution and compliance. We have rated 5 sectors. This is the 5th sector that we are rating. 6 round of ratings we have done. But we have not seen the level of non-compliance as we witnessed in the steel industry. Every plant we got reports of non-compliance. So non-compliance, in terms of non-compliance, if we were to rate each sector, then the steel had the worst performance. In most of the plants, we found air pollution, most companies were struggling, whether it was in stack or fugitive or work zone emission standards. We actually analyzed 45 recovery coke ovens, byproduct recovery coke ovens, and we found that only 11 were compliant with leakage norms. And these coke ovens release polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are carcinogenic. So, similarly, we looked at sinter plants. We analyzed 14 plants, sinter plants. We only found 3 to be compliant with stack emission norms. Most DRI plants, we found one kiln or another, especially the older kilns, not meeting the stack emission norms. Fugitive emission was a major problem in most of the plants, especially from raw material storage, handling, and transportation. And the reason being, like we found in cement sector when we rated, there is absolutely no guidance or standards to look at fugitive emission for material handling. Solid waste disposal is becoming a major air pollution source from DRI plants, sponge iron plants across the country. Water pollution, we found major problems largely with blast furnace plants having byproduct coke recovery. In fact, we found most not meeting cyanide and phenol norms. And also metallurgical wastewater, which steel industry, people from the steel industry will understand, we found they were not meeting suspended solids and heavy metal norms. In fact, again, this is unique rating because for the first time, GRP team actually collected sample and tested it. So we also did independent testing of water pollution from steel plants. Solid waste disposal, we found it to be a major problem with coal DRI plants, sponge iron plants, as most of them are now started disposing it outside the plant premises. And again, weak regulation and even poorer monitoring came out quite clearly in solid waste management. Environment, health and safety. Every plant has environment policy, environment department. In fact, this sector, most of them have ISO 14001 certification, OSHA's 18001 for safety, some even have SA 8000 for social accountability, decent working condition and human rights. So if you look at certification, the steel sector has everything. But again, this is the only sector, and we do this very rigorous correlation, and we did it in the past also. We found no correlation between the management system in the company and actual performance. In fact, plants with ISO 14001 had the same level of non-compliance as plants without ISO 14001. Similar was the case with OSHA's 18001. It had no correlation with occupational health and safety performance. In fact, as Uma already said, the 3 years data that we realized, we found 144 fatalities in the 17 plants for which we had data. 144, it's a shocking number. Almost 50 every year. And out of these, 63 were in 9 plants who are OSHA certified. So there is absolutely no correlation between occupational health and safety management system and what is the actual performance of occupational health and safety. And we also found that one of the major areas which the steel industry will have to work is to look at health and safety of contract workers. As now close to 50% of workers in the steel industry work on contract. It's a major area that needs work. Now, if this is the performance, how the future looks like is important to understand. Steel production has doubled in last decade in this country. In fact, from 1991, since economic liberalization happened, the growth rate is about 8%. If we just assume this growth rate, in next 20 years, our steel production will be close to 325 million ton. We are right now producing about 75 million ton. So fourfold increase in steel production will happen at 8% growth rate in next 20 years. We did a modeling exercise to look at process route, and what we find is that blast furnace, which produces about 45% of steel right now, will only produce about 30% in 2030. A major process shift will happen towards sponge iron, direct reduced as well as smelt reduced iron making processes. Now this is significant because compared to blast furnace, the technology has advanced. Energy efficiency is high. Coal DRI as well as smelt reduction processes have lower energy efficiency. So this process shift will have implication for environment performance in future. For example, look at pollution. Right now, on an average, Indian steel sector disposes about half a ton of solid waste per ton of crude steel. It's about 300 kgs for blast furnace plant on an average, 1 ton for sponge iron plants. Currently, therefore, the steel industry is disposing about 30 million tons of solid waste. Now, for 325 million ton production, this number will be about 150 to 200 million tons. So scale, even if steel industry becomes very efficient, the scale is so high that the waste generation will overwhelm. And you can look at the example of Vizag Steel. It is a reasonably efficient plant in terms of waste management. It currently disposes about 200-240 kgs of waste per ton of steel production, disposes about 0.7 million tons every year. For 3 million ton capacity it has right now. It plans to become 10 million ton, will have to dispose 2.5 million ton. And therefore, as you expand, unless and until there is significant improvement in efficiency, the waste problem will overwhelm the sector. Similar is the case with water. Currently, the sector consumes 700 million tons of water. This is sufficient to provide water to 20 million people. By 2030, it will require 3.4 billion meter cube of water, sufficient to provide water to close to 100 million people. So that's the scale effect of the steel sector in future. Land, as I said, 75,000 hectares currently. Even if the steel sector becomes very efficient, and this estimation we have done by taking 270 hectares per million ton capacity, the steel sector will still need about 65,000 hectares more in next 20 years. Coal consumption will increase fourfold. Iron ore obviously will increase fourfold. CO2 emission will increase again to about 800 million tons in 2030, which is, and just to give you a comparison, India's current total emission is 1.6 billion ton. So steel in 2030 will emit half of what India is emitting currently. So that's the kind of scale effect that is going to happen. So significant improvement in efficiency and pollution control is required. And therefore there are two key messages that comes out of Green Rating project. One, there is a tremendous scope for improvement in all areas. But second is actually a warning that if business as usual continues, which seems to be the case right now, then the sheer size will create insurmountable problem. And therefore we don't have to talk about marginal improvements in the steel sector if it wants to grow. We need to start thinking about leapfrog solutions. Marginal improvements will not work. That's broadly what the sector assessment is.